Named Herbert Corey, he was a character in New York's Greenwich Village for years. Now he's a sensation to many teenagers.
Tiny Tim collapsed on stage in 1996 while singing the song that made him famous. But the way he died was not even close to the strangest thing about him. Behind the ukulele and the high-pitched voice was a man who bathed 5 times a day, then stopped washing his hair and called his dandruff holy dust. He married live on TV in front of 45 million people, yet claimed celibacy for decades. And the most shocking part? He wore adult diapers under his Victorian suits during every performance. Today, we're uncovering the bizarre truth about the man who fooled America with innocence. Tiny Tim came into the world with a name nobody would ever put on a marquee: Herbert Boutros Corey. He was born on April 12, 1932, in Manhattan, right in the middle of a city that never stopped moving, even when families like his were barely holding on. His home was unusual for that time, not because it was big or safe, but because it was mixed in a way that made people stare. His father, Boutros Corey, came through Ellis Island around 1910 from Beirut, Lebanon, a young textile worker chasing factory hours in New York City. His mother, Tilly Staff, was a Jewish garment worker who had fled Brest-Litovsk, Belarus in 1914, only 15 years old then, carrying fear and grit like luggage she could never put down. So Herbert grew up inside 2 worlds that did not always agree: a Maronite Christian father, an Orthodox Jewish mother, a cramped Washington Heights apartment during Depression-era America. It could be tense, it could be loud, yet it could also be strangely musical. Christian hymns would fill one corner of the room, then Jewish prayers would rise from another, and the kid in the middle would soak it all in without even realizing he was building a foundation. Later, when people tried to figure him out, he would talk about those sounds like they shaped him first. Not fame, not TV, not applause, just the mix of faith, rules, and immigrant survival, all packed into one small home. As a child, he shared a bedroom in the Bronx with his brother Daniel, and that closeness made everything feel louder, even silence. Then one day, at least in his memory, the door cracked open to another time. He found his father's stack of 78 RPM records, and suddenly, the apartment was not just an apartment anymore. It was a stage. It was vaudeville. It was old voices that sounded scratchy and emotional, like they were singing through a wall. Records with stars like Sophie Tucker became his secret teacher. He did not just listen, he copied them. He watched their mannerisms in his head and tried them on like costumes, right there in a crowded room where privacy barely existed. That is where his love for pre-rock American music started. Not in some fancy lesson, but in stolen moments with a phonograph and a kid who felt different. And different was not always safe. His father was strict, the kind of man who believed discipline could keep a family from falling apart. Boutros demanded daily Bible readings. Herbert was pushed into scripture so hard that by age 6 he could recite entire psalms from memory. It did not just teach him words. It taught him a mood, a seriousness, a feeling that music and faith could sit in the same chair. That is why, later on, he did not perform like a normal pop singer. He acted like a man on a mission. He saw himself as a troubadour of God. And as strange as that sounded to people, to him, it felt real. It felt like the only honest way to be on stage. Then, his body made childhood harder. He suffered from rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D, and it left him with soft, weakened bones and a slight limp. In the 1930s, rickets could hit as many as 60% of children in poor urban families, especially in crowded cities with poor nutrition and limited sunlight. For Herbert, it meant he could not run like other kids. He could not blend in during sports. He often ended up alone, so he went deeper into sound instead. He listened more. He wandered more. He sat for hours in Central Park, letting jazz and folk music drift into him like a second language. That loneliness did not crush his imagination. It fed it. It made him build an inner world where music was not just entertainment, it was company. Then, the Great Depression hit even harder at home. After the 1938 economic crash, his father Boutros lost his factory job, and the air in the apartment changed. Less certainty, more stress. Tilly began sewing dresses at home to keep money coming in. Herbert was only 7, but he found his own way to chase what he loved. He started scavenging for discarded 78 RPM records, in alleyways near Harlem jazz clubs, hunting for forgotten songs and strange titles like the Tipperary Twins. To most people, that would have been trash. To him, it was treasure. He was building an ear for the rare and the overlooked, and without knowing it, he was training himself to become a living museum of old American music. By 1943, he was 11, and the world was not gentle with a boy who sounded unusual. His high-pitched voice made him a target. The bullying piled up until school stopped feeling like a place for him. He drifted away from the normal path, and Times Square became his classroom. He spent hours at Hubert's Museum, watching sword swallowers, fire eaters, and performers who made their living by being strange in public. That place stayed in his bones. He watched costumes and learned how a person could turn shock into attention. He even took inspiration so literally that he wore a bedsheet like a toga during early performances, as if he was already practicing the idea that you can survive by turning yourself into a spectacle. A couple of years later, in 1945, he was 13, and he started testing his voice on real people, not crowds that chose him, but relatives who did not. He would sneak onto the stages at family weddings and perform uninvited, holding a borrowed harmonica, singing falsetto versions of Rudy Vallee's Honey. Some family members were horrified, some laughed, and some uncles slipped him pocket change. It was small money, but it was huge proof. He could walk into a room that did not want him and still make people look. By the end of 1945, he was becoming a regular, controversial presence at those events, and he was learning a painful lesson early. If you want to perform, you have to keep going even when people want you to stop. In 1947, at 15, he made a purchase that turned into a lifelong signature. He bought his first ukulele for $5 from a pawn shop in Greenwich Village. It was not a gift. It was not a lucky break. It was a decision. He taught himself left-handed by mirroring the right-handed techniques he saw other players use, practicing in front of a mirror until his hands obeyed. Greenwich Village was full of folk musicians and artists, and he soaked up the scene like a sponge, learning songs and styles just by being near it. That $5 ukulele was not just an instrument, it was a doorway. But even then, home pressure did not disappear. In 1948, his parents discovered he had been performing secretly at local PTA meetings, singing old Edwardian ballads like Under the Bamboo Tree in front of parents and teachers who did not know what to do with him. His father, Boutros, did not see a future in that. He demanded stability. He threatened to destroy the ukulele unless Herbert gave up performing and took a real job as a stock boy. It was not just an argument about music. It was a fight about survival, respectability, and fear. Herbert tried to appease them with odd jobs, but he kept chasing the stage anyway, because that was the only place where he felt like himself. By 1949, he was searching for a name that could protect him, or at least announce him before anyone could laugh. He cycled through stage names at Bronx amateur nights, including Herbie the Falsetto King. The pay was small, sometimes $2 per set, and the crowds could be cruel. He would show up in a curly wig and an oversized bow tie he made from his mother's scarves, trying to mimic early performers from another era. People jeered. He kept singing. Night after night, he learned how to stay standing, while embarrassment tried to push him off the stage. Slowly, that stubbornness became part of the act. By 1950, he was 18 and living cheap, tucked into a $10 a month boarding house in Washington Heights. He busked on subway platforms during rush hour, calling himself Larry Love the Singing Canary, yodeling forgotten songs like The Bird on Nellie's Hat at commuters who just wanted to get home. Coins hit the ground. Some people stared. Some walked away fast. He kept going anyway. He spent hours at the New York Public Library, listening to rare 78s and Edison cylinders, building an archive in his mind, like he was afraid the songs would die if he did not remember them. The grind got rougher in 1952 when he landed a semi-professional gig at Captain Jinx's Inferno, a Hell's Kitchen strip club known for rowdy crowds. He went on as Dapper Dan the Ukulele Man, strumming between burlesque acts, trying to sing softly, while drunk patrons demanded loud and normal. Bottles got thrown. He learned to dodge them. He later put it bluntly, if you couldn't dodge bottles, you didn't last long at Captain Jinx's Inferno. Yet, he stayed long enough to sharpen his voice, and by 1953, he won second place at the Old Alliance Club's amateur night with a falsetto, "You Are My Sunshine." That small prize mattered because it proved something to him. Even when people hated the act, they still listened. In 1954, he auditioned for Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts as Emmett Swink and got rejected for being too weird. That word could have crushed him. Instead, it pushed him to lean in harder. He started adding Victorian flower arrangements to his props, and he sourced them in the strangest way, by dumpster diving at funeral homes. It sounds dark, but to him, it was theater. He called himself a cartoonist of music, and he performed standards with exaggerated humor that still carried real respect. By 1956, now moving through names like Sir Timothy Timms, he was performing in Coney Island sideshows and singing "Tiptoe Through the Tulips" in falsetto for tiny crowds who paid a nickel to watch the strange man with the high voice. He said every nickel was a trophy, and that line tells you everything about his heart. He was poor, but he was proud. He was laughed at, but he was still standing there, holding his ukulele like it was proof that he existed. The underground kept feeding him. In 1958, he opened for a calypso band at the Village Vanguard as Judas K. Foxglove, and a microphone malfunction during "I Don't Care If the Sun Don't Shine" got him fired. It felt like disaster in the moment. Later, he remembered it differently, saying, "I thought I was ruined, but it was actually the moment I became famous underground." Stories spread. People talked about the ukulele oddity who could yodel on cue and pull forgotten songs out of thin air. By 1959, he was a regular again around Times Square, spaces like Hubert's Museum and the Live Flea Circus, billed as the Singing Canary, still broke, but refusing to let that stop him from building a life out of old music. He spent hours at the New York Public Library, listening to rare 78s and Edison cylinders, collecting a private archive like a man trying to save a whole era from disappearing. In 1960, a 28-year-old man named Herbert Buckingham Corey walked onto a small Greenwich Village stage and introduced himself as Tiny Tim. The name itself felt like a quiet joke, because he stood 6'1", tall and awkward, carrying a ukulele and a voice that sounded like it had slipped out of another century. The name came from his manager, George King, chosen after a strange booking mix-up with a midget act. But once it stuck, Herbert leaned into it completely. That first real foothold came at Cafe Bazaar, where he played marathon 12-hour sets, pulling songs from the 1890s like "Tiptoe Through the Tulips" and "On the Good Ship Lollipop." The beatnik crowd did not know what to do with him. They laughed. They mocked. Some nights they tried to drown him out. Still, he stayed on stage and kept going, night after night, slowly realizing that endurance itself could become a weapon. Over time, the laughter softened into curiosity. Tiny Tim became a regular face in the village, especially at Page 3, where by 1963 he was playing 6 hours a night, 6 days a week, for just $96 a month. It was exhausting and barely paid the bills, yet it shaped him. Every night sharpened his falsetto, his timing, and his odd confidence. People began showing up not to laugh, but to listen. Something about the strange mix of innocence and obsession pulled them in. Around that same time, in 1961, another young musician drifted into his orbit at Cafe Wah on McDougal Street. Bob Dylan noticed him. They bonded in a way that surprised people, not through fame or ambition, but through dusty records and forgotten songs. Dylan called Tiny Tim the last great minstrel. Late at night, they sat in the club kitchen, eating hamburgers and fries made by Norbert the cook, talking endlessly about Lead Belly records and old melodies no one else seemed to care about anymore. Dylan was stunned by Tiny Tim's memory and depth. He invited him back to his McDougal Street apartment, where they recorded rough demos like The Old Maid's Waltz. That friendship quietly placed Tiny Tim inside the heart of the folk revival, even if he never quite fit its shape. By 1962, his act began to change. At the bitter end, one of the most respected clubs in the village, Tiny Tim leaned harder into unpredictability. He would sing "Shine on Harvest Moon" and suddenly stop to recite psalms. Some people stared in confusion. Others walked out. Yet a small group leaned closer. sensing honesty beneath the chaos. Folk purists started to defend him, calling him an archivist rather than a joke, someone protecting songs that had been abandoned by modern music. Slowly, a cult following formed, drawn to the strange blend of faith, vaudeville, and nostalgia that no one else could copy. In 1963, Tiny Tim scraped together enough money to self-fund his first single, Tiptoe, to the gas chambers. It went nowhere commercially. Still, within village circles, the record passed from hand to hand like a secret. Elektra Records heard the noise but dismissed him as too vaudeville for folk. That rejection stung, yet it also fueled him. He kept performing, kept refining, convinced that failure was simply part of the road. 6 years later, that same stubbornness would matter more than anyone realized. A small but meaningful shift came in 1964 when he opened for the Lovin' Spoonful at the Scene on West 46th Street. The room was packed with modern sounds and rising stars, yet Tiny Tim stepped out with a left-handed ukulele and sang Alexander's Ragtime Band. John Sebastian watched closely. He later said Tiny Tim reminded younger musicians of music's forgotten charm. That night proved something important. Even surrounded by new trends, Tiny Tim could still hold a room. Then everything changed in September 1967. Rowan and Martin's Laugh aired as a one-time special, and Tiny Tim appeared in a top hat and cape, singing A Tisket a Tasket and on The Good Ship Lollipop. America stopped and stared. Letters poured in, hundreds of them. Viewers called him the voice of innocence. Within weeks, ukulele sales jumped by 200% across the country. NBC signed him for recurring appearances. An outsider had slipped into mainstream television without smoothing out his edges, and people loved him for it. In 1968, he became a regular on The Tonight Show. 12 appearances in 1 year. No other musical guest did that. One night, he proposed on air to a fictional character named Miss Tulips. Ratings jumped by 15%. Producers praised his wholesome weirdness, a strange comfort during a time filled with Vietnam headlines and national unrest. By mid-1968, Reprise Records signed him. His debut album, God Bless Tiny Tim, hit number 7 on the Billboard chart and stayed there for 32 weeks. It sold over 200,000 copies. Session musicians struggled as he demanded real 1920s phrasing and instruments. He refused shortcuts. That same year, Tiptoe Through the Tulips reached number 17 on the Hot 100 and sold more than 1.2 million copies. He recorded it 50 times before approving the final version, claiming a dream about Rudy Vallee guided him. By the end of 1968, he was touring 50 cities, earning the equivalent of $50,000 per show. He even required audiences to recite the Lord's Prayer before encores. Some walked out, others stayed and believed. In December 1969, Tiny Tim married Miss Vicky Live on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. 45 million people watched. The stage overflowed with $20,000 worth of tulips. It became the second most watched broadcast of the decade, just behind the moon landing. Carson joked it was freakier than space itself. For Tiny Tim, it was fame at its loudest and strangest. The years that followed were full of contrasts. Grammy nominations, European tours, Royal Albert Hall in 1971, where he dedicated a song to Jimi Hendrix. A Vegas residency by 1972, paying $100,000 a week. Yet slowly, the shock faded. His career shifted from center stage to niche devotion. Still, through all of it, Tiny Tim never stopped being exactly who he was. And that, more than any chart position, is what kept his story alive. Tiny Tim always felt hard to place, even when the whole world thought they had him figured out. People saw the hair, the suit, the ukulele, the voice that could turn sweet and strange in the same breath. But under all of that was a man who kept trying to stitch music, faith, and attention into one life, even when the stitches kept tearing. In December 1968, he drifted into Beatles history in the most unexpected way. A Christmas flexi disc was being made for the official fan club, and George Harrison personally produced Tiny Tim's wild take on Nowhere Man, recorded in New York. It landed on the same disc as odd little band snippets, and a sped-up Helter Skelter. Harrison even thanked him on the record and blessed him, and word spread that Tiny Tim had also shown up around Abbey Road during the Let It Be era. strumming for Paul McCartney. In a city full of polished stars, Tiny Tim still found a way to be noticed, not because he fit in, but because he refused to. A year later, on December 17, 1969, he turned his private life into a public event. He married Miss Vicky on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, and more than 45 million people watched it happen. The stage was filled with 10,000 tulips, a loud, bright tribute to Tiptoe Through the Tulips. And for a moment, it looked like a fairy tale that could not fail. But the marriage quickly sounded more like a performance than a home. They had a daughter, Tulip Victoria, in 1971. Yet even family life had its odd rules. Their living setup was unusual, with separate Brooklyn brownstones connected by a hallway. And Tiny Tim was said to visit in a way that felt more formal than warm, almost like he was stepping into a role he did not know how to live inside. By 1977, it ended in divorce, and stories followed him about how he talked about women and desire in numbers and strange confessions, as if he was trying to explain himself and only getting further away. Then his career took a turn that showed how unpredictable he really was. In 1973, Filmation cast him as the voice of Gilligan in the animated series The New Adventures of Gilligan. It sounded perfect on paper. Tiny Tim was meant to sing sea shanties through the show, keeping it playful for kids. But after just one episode, everything shifted. He demanded that Bible verses be added to the scripts so he could preach during his songs. The producers did not see it coming, and they did not know what to do with it. He was reportedly fired mid-production after only a single recording session. The exact verse he wanted was never clearly documented, yet the point was already clear. He could not separate his belief from his act, even when the job begged for simplicity. As the years moved on, the spotlight got smaller, and the rooms got stranger. In 1975, he went on Howard Stern's radio show and spoke about a desperate stretch where he earned $5,000 for a single night at a Florida carnival, framed as a freak fiddler. He described playing between alligator shows, still clinging to that ukulele as if it was the one thing that would never betray him. There was shame in it, and pride too, because that money kept him afloat and helped fund another album. By 1980, he was working with the Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers Circus, doing 3 shows a day for $300 a week. He slipped into the circus rhythm, sang, and leaned into the weirdness that the mainstream once laughed at and later forgot. Behind the scenes, he even mentored young ukulele players, passing the instrument on as if he was trying to prove it was never a joke to him. In 1984, the weirdness took a darker shape. He was cast in the low-budget horror film Blood Harvest, after director Bill Rebane saw him perform at a Wisconsin beer tent carnival. Tiny Tim was offered $1,000 to play Merv, a crazed clown who could turn a ukulele into something threatening. During the audition, he let out a falsetto scream of, "Stay away, Joe," and the director later described it as pure nightmare fuel. The film had little budget and a rushed shoot, and it flopped commercially. Yet, the role gave him a cult afterlife. It also showed something painful. He was willing to take any door that stayed open, even if it led into a room lit by cheap horror lights and nervous laughter. Then, 1985 arrived and brought more noise. That year, his feud with Howard Stern hit a peak when Stern mocked his hygiene and habits on the radio. Tiny Tim sued for defamation and demanded $50,000 in damages. And then the whole thing twisted into a truce when Stern booked him for 50 appearances instead. Tiny Tim came back again and again, turning conflict into airtime, and even showed up with a jar of his salsa diet recipe, insisting it was the secret to health and long life. Around the same period, he released the controversial single, Santa Claus Has Got the AIDS This Year, in 1985, and it caused an uproar for how directly it referenced the AIDS epidemic. He defended it as public health gospel, but radio stations and fans pushed back, and it only deepened his reputation as a man who could not stop himself from touching the nerve everyone else avoided. The older he got, the more his life felt built from odd rituals. People talked about extreme swings in hygiene, from bathing up to 5 times a day in the 1960s, with rose-scented soap, to later claiming his hair-trapped divine inspiration. Stories followed him about combing dandruff into holy dust. In 1993, Tour managers described him drinking 2 full jars of peche picante salsa every day and eating raw russet potatoes peeled with his teeth, calling it complete nutrition and framing bloating as something spiritual and demonic. Even his relationships carried strange rules. He married again in 1984 to Miss Jan, and again in 1995 to Miss Sue, while also claiming celibacy after the 1960s. Some accounts describe bizarre, prayer-soaked foreplay rituals and long hours of guilt. He was also said to wear adult diapers under his Victorian suits during long sets, a habit traced back to his early busking days, all in the name of modesty and avoiding breaks. He even handed out an annual Most Beautiful Girl trophy to platonic crushes, as if he wanted closeness, but only on terms that kept him safe. In 1990, he tried to spark his own revival. He self-released the album Tiny Tim Rocks, covering 1950s rock songs such as Great Balls of Fire in a polka style, selling it through mail order. It reportedly moved about 10,000 copies, enough to fund a small Midwest tour. He brought back his ambidextrous ukulele gimmick, inviting fans to bring their own ukuleles and join him on stage. It was messy and intimate, and for a moment it sounded like the purest version of him. Not the novelty act, not the punchline, just a performer building a small world where he still mattered, but his body was already warning him. In 1992, at a ukulele festival at the Montague Book Mill in Massachusetts, he suffered a heart attack as he began Tiptoe Through the Tulips. He collapsed mid-set, then insisted on finishing anyway, telling paramedics backstage, "The Lord has more songs for me," before collapsing again. About 135 people were there, and many were stunned into tears, cheering while he was carried away on a stretcher. He ended up in intensive care for several days, and the story hardened into legend because it carried the same theme his whole life carried. He did not know how to stop performing, even when stopping might have saved him. In 1996, he pushed even harder. He completed a final tour with over 100 shows across Midwest fairs and small venues, earning about $200 per gig. At one Des Moines County fair, he debuted a new stage name, the Eternal Troubadour, and insisted on signing Bibles for fans after each show, even as his health declined. Doctors warned him about his heart, and he answered with a line that sounded both fearless and tired. "If I live 10 years, it's a miracle. 5 years, it's even more of a miracle. I am ready for anything that happens." He kept going anyway, and then came the night that turned into the final image people hold. On November 30th, 1996, at the Woman's Club in Minneapolis, Tiny Tim was 64 and already struggling mid-set. His face turned pale, but he played on through Tiptoe Through the Tulips, as if finishing the song could keep the ending away. He even dented his $800 Beltona ukulele as he collapsed after the final note. He was rushed to the hospital, and he died of a heart attack at 1:20 a.m. that night. It was haunting in the simplest way. He spent his whole life turning himself into a living performance, and then he left the world while still trying to give it one more song. After his death, the story kept growing. His daughter, Tulip Victoria Corey, later shared rare home videos and memories that showed a softer side, including Tiny teaching her ukulele when she was little and making personal lullabies. At the same time, the myth of his hidden depth expanded through claims of bootleg recordings, surfacing in 2004, including jam sessions with Bob Dylan from 1967. People also spoke about his estate holding more than 500 unreleased recordings, preserving up to 1,000 old American songs and rare arrangements, and even a 1970s ragtime-styled cover of Stairway to Heaven. He was said to be inducted into the Ukulele Hall of Fame in 2000, and his lifetime earnings were sometimes estimated around $10 million. Even the Beatles' flexi disc he appeared on became a collector item that could reach up to $5,000 at auctions.